We are looking at a highly specific diagnostic landscape today when it comes to hardware security. And the core evidence question is just central to everything we're going to discuss. Like, what is actually established regarding this expanded official advisory for Coldcard and, what remains just an unverified claim?
Right, because there's a lot of noise out there right now.
Exactly. So this is an unnumbered Clawcast Special deep dive. We are focusing entirely on parsing out the official vendor scope, examining the conditional mechanism that's being debated right now, and really evaluating how different wallet architectures completely change their migration boundaries.
Yeah.
And just so you know, this will not displace our regular Tuesday release. But we are setting aside the noise today. We're taking a very skeptical, calm, and, highly specific look at the evidence ladder here.
And honestly, that calm posture is just a total necessity. Because, well, when a security advisory expands in the hardware space, the initial reaction from the community is almost universally just they rush to flatten all the technical nuance into a single panic point.
Oh, yeah, the sky is falling immediately.
Exactly. But an official vendor correction can be incredibly important, and it can absolutely mandate user action without necessarily closing every single technical question about how a system operated in the past.
Yeah.
We really have to separate the verified operational scope from the proposed mechanism.
Right, because, in the rush of tech news, a hypothesis often gets treated like a full postmortem. It's kind of like finding a blueprint for a trapdoor, right? Like, it proves the trapdoor could theoretically be built, but it does not prove the trapdoor was actually installed in the specific house you are standing in. We need the actual evidence.
That's a great way to look at it. We have to look at what was built versus what the vendor confirms.
So let's just ground this immediately in that verified operational scope. We need to look at exactly what the vendor has stated on the record. I want to be incredibly precise here. Coinkite's revised advisor names, MK3 seeds, generated on 4.0.1 through 4.1.9 inclusive.
Yeah, and the inclusion of those endpoints is the critical first boundary. So if you generated a cryptographic seed on an MK3 device running version 4.0.1 or 4.1.9, or literally any firmware version strictly between those two numbers, you are inside the affected boundary named by the vendor. This establishes the baseline for the MK3 hardware.
Right. But the scope is no longer just the MK3, and this is the expansion we really need to address carefully today. Coinkite's revised advisory includes seeds created before the fixed release on MK4, MK5, and Q. Coinkite estimates about 72 bits rather than the expected 128, says impact is less severe than MK3 but serious, and says its review continues.
And we really have to unpack what those numbers mean, like in a physical and mathematical sense, because, hearing 72 bits and 128 bits can sound really abstract to a lot of people.
It's just numbers on a page.
Right. When a hardware device generates a Bitcoin seed, the target standard is 128 bits of entropy. And entropy is just a fundamental measure of cryptographic unpredictability. You can kind of think of each bit as a perfectly random coin flip heads or tails, 0 or 1. So to get a 128-bit key, an attacker would essentially have to search a space of 2 to the power of 128 possibilities.
Which is, that's a number so large it just strains human comprehension. It's often compared to, the number of atoms in a region of the universe or something.
Yeah, it's practically unsearchable by modern or even theoretical computing power. It's secure. But when the entropy drops, that search space collapses exponentially. It's not a linear drop. So the MK3 issue during that specific window, it involved a severe search space. But now look at the newer models. Coinkite estimates about 72 bits for the prefix MK4, MK5, and Q models. 2 to the power of 72 is an enormously larger number than 2 to the power of 40.
Okay, so mathematically, it is a much wider search space.
Yes. Vastly more resources and time would be required to search it.
Which perfectly explains the vendor's statement that the impact is less severe than the MK3 issue, but, they still classify it as serious.
It is classified as serious because 72 bits still falls fundamentally short of that 128-bit cryptographic standard that's, required for long-term secure key generation. And it's really important to reiterate here that these are vendor estimates under an ongoing review. They're not independent measurements. But from just a pure operational standpoint, the scope has definitively widened.
So if you generated a seed on these newer models before the fixed release, you are in the affected scope, period.
Exactly.
Which brings us directly to the fixed release matrix. The vendor has mapped out a highly specific set of firmware versions that contain the fix for this issue, and we just need to be incredibly precise here for everyone listening.
We do, because the matrix is dependent on both the hardware model and the specific release track the user has chosen to use. So for the MK3, the fixed firmware is version 4.2.0 or later. For the MK4 and MK5 operating on the standard track, the fixed firmware is 5.60 or later. And for the Q on a standard track, it is 1.5.0Q or later.
And we really have to stop and clearly define those tracks right now. Because there is the standard track and there is the edge track. For the MK4 and MK5 on edge, the fixed version is 6.6.0x or later. For the Q on edge, it is 6.60QX or later. I want to emphasize the mechanics of this. Standard and edge are completely separate development tracks.
They are entirely parallel release paths. I mean, hardware manufacturers often maintain different branches of their code, so the standard track is typically the stable release, while the X track might contain, newer features or different configurations. And because they are separate branches of code entirely, their version numbering schemes are independent of each other.
So a user cannot simply look at the first digit and make a wild assumption. You can't just say, well, my firmware starts with a 6 and the standard fix is a 5, so my device must be secure.
Oh, that would be a critical mistake. If you are running the edge track, you must evaluate your status strictly against the edge version numbers. So 6.6.0x or later for the MK4 and MK5, for instance, you have to match the exact physical model sitting on your desk and the specific software track you opted into against the exact matrix Coinkite provided.
All right, let's move to the most vital operational rule for anyone navigating this matrix right now. Because honestly, misunderstanding this next point is exactly where catastrophic user errors happen. Install the fixed firmware for the exact model and release track before creating a replacement. Updating does not repair a seed already generated.
And we need to dive deep into the mechanics of why updating does not repair a seed already generated. It all comes down to how microcontrollers interact with secure flash memory during the genesis moment of a private key.
Let's break down that genesis moment because, when I tell my hardware wallet to create a new seed, what is physically happening inside the device?
Well, the device is calling upon its entropy sources, whether that's a dedicated hardware, random number generator chip, or environmental noise, or even system timers. It's trying to gather that target 128 bits of pure randomness. It takes that raw randomness, processes it, and translates it into the BIP39 mnemonic, the 12 or 24 words you write down on paper. Those words are the master key.
Right, and once those words are generated, they are written to the device's secure storage.
Yes. They are static. They are mathematically locked. The firmware on your device is simply the instruction manual telling the processor how to operate, how to sign transactions, how to display menus, how to interact with the secure element.
So when you update the firmware, you are essentially just downloading a new instruction manual.
Exactly. You are replacing the operating instructions. You are patching the code that tells the device how to generate future randomness. But a firmware update does not retroactively reach into the secure flash memory, pull out your existing 24 words, and somehow inject new entropy into them.
It can't go back in time.
No, the seed is a permanent artifact of the exact moment it was created. If the system's ability to gather randomness was degraded at that specific genesis moment, well, the resulting seed has low entropy forever, regardless of what software you install on the device tomorrow.
And that is why the sequence of operations is just so rigid. You must verify the official relief path, you must install the fixed firmware first, patching the instruction manual, and only then can you command the device to generate a brand new replacement seed, drawing on the corrected entropy mechanisms.
Right. That is literally the only way to establish a clean key generation environment.
Now, Coinkite's advisory does provide some very specific boundaries regarding alternative entropy sources, and I'm talking specifically about physical dice and passphrases. A lot of users rely on these, so we really need to understand exactly what the vendor says mitigates the issue and what doesn't.
Yeah, let's start with dice. Coinkite provides explicit boundaries for how physical dice interact with this entropy reduction. And there are two distinct paths here. First, there is the optional dice-only advanced route.
What does that advanced route actually entail?
Coinkite says this is specifically for an empty MK3 device after it has been updated to the fixed 4.2.0 firmware. It requires a minimum of 99 rolls of a fair six-sided die. In this specific advanced flow, the device hashes the user's dice rolls directly to create the seed, and it entirely bypasses the device's own internal random number generators. But, this is not the standard new wallet setup flow that most users engage with.
Okay, so for the general user who simply added some dice rolls during the normal wallet creation process on an affected firmware version, what is the boundary there?
For general dice usage during the affected windows, Coinkite says that if you provided 50 to 98 private, independent, fair dice rolls, That input alone contributes at least 128 bits of entropy. If you provided 99 or more independent private roles, they estimate it contributes approximately 256 bits of entropy.
Let's explain the math behind that briefly, because standard six-sided die provides about 2.58 bits of entropy per roll. So 50 rolls times 2.58 gets you just over the 128-bit threshold. It's just sheer mathematical accumulation, right?
It is mathematical accumulation, yes, assuming the inputs are perfect. And that is the massive condition attached to this remedy. Coinkite explicitly states that if you provided fewer than 50 roles, or if there's literally any uncertainty about the privacy, fairness, or exact count of those roles, the user must migrate.
The human element is the vulnerability there.
Huge vulnerability. The physical execution is incredibly difficult to guarantee after the fact. I mean, were the dice perfectly balanced?
Right.
Did you accidentally miscount and only roll 48 times? Was there a camera in the room? Did someone look over your shoulder?
Right, because the sequence of those dice rolls constitutes raw secret key material.
Exactly. If an attacker knows the sequence of your rolls, they know your seed. The vendor's guidance is clear. If you cannot absolutely guarantee the perfect execution and total secrecy of those 50-plus rolls, you must treat the seed as compromised and migrate. It is a bounded condition, not a universal safety net.
Which leads us directly to the BIP39 passphrase, which is so often misunderstood in this space. A lot of people refer to it as the 13th word or 25th word, and some users just assume that applying a strong passphrase completely negates any underlying hardware vulnerability.
We have to unpack how the BIP39 standard actually processes a passphrase to understand why that assumption is flawed. A BIP39 passphrase is not a PIN. A PIN just unlocks the physical hardware sitting on your desk. A BIP39 passphrase is fundamentally different. It is injected into the cryptographic math that derives your wallet.
So it changes the derivation.
It alters the output entirely. The BIP39 standard uses a key stretching function called PBKDF2, which stands for Password-Based Key Derivation Function 2. It takes your 12 or 24 seed words, combines them with your chosen passphrase, and runs them through a hashing algorithm, specifically HMAC HHA 512 2048 times.
So it's performing intense mathematical churning.
Very intense churning, and it's designed specifically to make brute forcing slow and computationally expensive. Because of this, a strong, unique BIP39 passphrase acts as an independent, strength-dependent barrier. If an attacker somehow discovers your underlying 24 words, they cannot access your Bitcoin unless they also guess your passphrase and run that slow PBKDF2 function for every single guess.
Right, so if the passphrase is just password, they guess it instantly. If the passphrase is 20 random characters, the barrier holds. But here's a critical limitation. It acts as a barrier, but it does not retroactively repair a compromised seed.
The foundational entropy of the seed words remains unchanged. If the 24 words were generated with only 40 or 72 bits of randomness, that underlying foundation is mathematically weak. The passphrase is a very strong door installed on a house with a compromised foundation.
That makes sense.
The door might hold, but the structure beneath it is fundamentally unsound. Therefore, Coinkite still recommends migration. You must treat a strong BIP39 passphrase as a bounded condition that provides defense in depth. It is not a retroactive repair for the degraded seed generation.
Okay, so we have established the vendor's official scope, the fixed firmware matrix, and the explicit limits of dice and passphrases. Now we need to evaluate the outside research that is really driving the broader conversation right now. And to do that objectively, without falling into panic or hype, we have to establish an evidence ladder. We need to categorize the information we are looking at so you, the listener, understand the hierarchy of facts.
Structuring the evidence is the only way to analyze this clearly. So at the top rung of this ladder, the most authoritative layer, we have Coinkite's official advisory. This defines the operational scope, the exact models and firmware versions affected, and it provides the vendor's estimates of the entropy reduction. This is the manufacturer stating on the record what they acknowledge and what their internal review indicates.
Okay, stepping down one rung, what is next?
Next, we have the signed GitHub release metadata for the MK3 4.2.0 artifact.
What does signed release metadata actually establish? Because that sounds highly technical.
It involves digital signatures, usually GPG signatures, applied to the compiled binary files. When a vendor publishes a firmware update, they sign it with their private cryptographic keys. Anyone can then use the vendor's known public key to verify that signature. This corroborates the release path and the integrity of the files. It proves cryptographically that Coinkite officially published this specific fixed binary at this specific time and that the file hasn't been tampered with in transit.
But it doesn't tell us why the fix was needed.
Right. That is the absolute limit of its evidentiary weight. It corroborates the integrity of the patch. It does not independently prove the root cause of the vulnerability inside the code. It does not establish the size of the candidate search space for an attacker. It does not provide an exploit throughput benchmark. And it certainly does not prove that old seeds are magically repaired. It is proof of a patch's authenticity, nothing more.
Which brings us to the third rung of the ladder, blocks engineering analysis. And this is where we really transition from verified vendor scope to proposed mechanism.
Yeah, blocks analysis proposes a mechanism model. They are offering a technical hypothesis for how the entropy reduction occurred at the code level. It is a highly technical, mathematically coherent model, but it is entirely conditional. It requires specific conditions to be true in the real-world production environment.
Let's explore those conditions. What exactly does Block's article argue?
Blocks analysis models a compile-time RNG selection or fallback alongside a reseed account. To understand this, we have to look at how embedded firmware is actually built. The code base for a hardware wallet is designed to support different physical boards in different configurations.
So the programmers write one large set of source code, and then they use tools to compile it into the specific machine code needed for a specific device.
Yes, they use a compiler and a C preprocessor. The preprocessor reads directives in the code, often called macros or flags, that basically tell the compiler which sections of code to include and which to ignore. Block's model focuses on a specific macro named micro-pi-quimblering.
If premise A and premise B are true, the catastrophic conclusion follows. But this leads us to the crucial caveat of this entire deep dive, the unresolved core.
We must state clearly that the historical production build path remains entirely unresolved in this evidence packet.
What exactly is the historical production build path?
It is the exact step-by-step process that occurred on the day Coinkite compiled the firmware that was shipped to users. Block's model relies on the assumption that specific compile time flags were set in a specific way, but we do not have independent proof of the per-compilation unit flags that were actually used. We do not have the symbol resolution maps from that specific build environment. We do not have the exact submodule pins.
So we have the public source code, which shows the possibility of this fallback path, but we don't have the final verified receipt of how the factory actually compiled it years ago.
We do not have a byte-identical reproduction of the affected firmware images that independently verifies the software took this exact fallback path in production. Reproducible builds are notoriously difficult to achieve retroactively without access to the exact compiler versions, operating system environments, and dependency trees used at the time. Without that byte-identical reproduction, Block's mechanism remains a highly detailed hypothesis regarding production builds.
Which means we cannot simply accept the model as absolute historical fact. There is no full end-to-end benchmark provided here.
Block's article does not provide an empirical exploitability benchmark. There is no validated hardware profile demonstrating the physical extraction of these seeds based on this model. There are no timing window confirmations proving exactly how predictable those boot timers are on the physical microcontroller. There is no cost model for the attack and no proof of practical attack capability against a user in the real world.
It is a proposed mechanism. Coherent, but conditional. And because it is conditional, we have to be extremely careful when we apply it to bounded implications. You know, the cascading questions regarding other models and protocols that listeners are asking about.
Right. The implications must be bounded by the evidence we actually have. So let's look at the older MK2 model.
Is the MK2 affected?
The MK2 is not named in Coinkite's revised affected scope. The vendor has not included it. Now, Block's broader mechanism model suggests the MK2 could theoretically be affected under their hypothesis. However, because Block's model remains unresolved regarding the historical production build path, the MK2's status remains completely unestablished by the current evidence. We cannot call it affected, and we cannot call it safe. It sits outside the verified scope.
What about the BIP85 protocol? This is a standard that allows a user to generate multiple child wallets from a single parent seed. If the parent seed was created on an affected firmware version, does that mean BIP85 is just broken?
No BIP85 specific defect is established here. The BIP85 protocol uses HMAC-HA512 for hierarchical deterministic derivation. The math of the protocol itself did not fail. However, cryptography is bound by the rules of inheritance. A child seed derived from a compromised parent can inherit the parent's compromised problem. If an attacker discovers the weak parent seed, they can use the publicly documented BIP85 derivation paths to calculate all the child seeds. But that is a general cryptographic reality of compromised parent material, not evidence that the BIP85 protocol failed.
Let's evaluate multisig and Miniscript setups. Many users build 2 of 3 or 3 of 5 multisig wallets to distribute their risk. How does this entropy issue impact a multisig quorum?
Multisig changes the result only through threshold and independence. A descriptor, the text that defines the structure and public keys of your multisig wallet, does not repair a weak signer.
So if I have a 2 of 3 wallet and all 3 of those seeds were generated on a single affected MK3 device, my entire setup shares that exact same compromised foundation.
Exactly. The threshold doesn't protect you if all the key generation paths share the same vulnerability. However, if your 2 of 3 wallet relies on keys generated independently, on different architectures by different vendors, well, the threat model changes entirely. An attacker would have to compromise the weak seed and then somehow breach a completely independent, unaffected hardware architecture just to achieve the threshold required to spend funds.
The strength is in the independence of the generation environments. What about Miniscript?
Miniscript specifies spending policy. It is a structured language used to write complex conditions, like requiring 2 signatures after a certain block height, or a different signature immediately. Miniscript defines the descriptor structure. It is not a seed generator. There is no Miniscript-specific defect established by this advisory. The vulnerability resides in the underlying seed generation, not the policy language used to manage the resulting keys.
We also need to address privacy and public address exposure. There is a lot of speculation that knowing a user's public addresses makes it easier to exploit this vulnerability.
In a generic key search model, public addresses can serve as candidate validation material. However, it is vital to state that the reviewed evidence does not establish a coin join or pay join failure. Participating in collaborative privacy transactions does not inherently break the cryptography of the seed. Furthermore, the evidence does not show that this candidate validation technique was successfully used against a Coldcard user in the wild.
Which brings us to a crucial statement regarding real-world events. You may have seen large transaction movements discussed in conjunction with this research. I must state exactly, the earlier transaction observation remains unattributed. Neither the advisory nor blocks mechanism analysis establishes that this issue caused a particular wallet movement or loss.
That boundary is absolute. Observing a large consolidation transaction on a public ledger is just an observation of block space. Without forensic proof, cryptographically linking that specific transaction to a compromised firmware version, a specific attacker capability, and a targeted device, it is entirely unattributed. We cannot map a theoretical conditional mechanism directly onto blockchain activity without evidence.
So, understanding these strict boundaries, the verified vendor scope, the limits of the proposed mechanism, and the implications for multisig and inheritance, how does a listener evaluate the broader wallet ecosystem if they decide they absolutely must migrate? There are many different architectures out there.
We have to conduct an architecture comparison based purely on what the inspected official documentation describes. We are not ranking these products. We are not applying universal safety language. We will not call any product safe, unaffected, best, audited, bug-free, or a replacement. We are strictly examining how different vendors draw their trust boundaries.
Let's start with the BLL wallet, which operates primarily as a mobile application.
The inspected official documentation describes the BLL wallet as utilizing a mobile device and wallet implementation key boundary. It makes an on-device generation claim, meaning the cryptographic keys are intended to be generated and held strictly on the user's mobile phone hardware. However, it delegates the actual creation of the mnemonic words to BDK, the Bitcoin Development Kit libraries.
So the trust assumption relies on the mobile operating system, the physical phone hardware, and the external BDK library acting as the generation engine.
That is the defined boundary. The documentation also notes specific reproducibility limits. It's crucial to understand that reproducible builds, meaning you can verify the compiled app matches the open source code, are highly valuable for transparency, but they do not constitute an independent entropy audit of the underlying mobile operating system's random number generator.
What about Trezor? They have a long history, and their current lineup includes the Safe 3, Safe 5, and Safe 7.
Trezor's architecture relies on model-specific boundaries. You cannot evaluate their entire lineup as a single monolith. The inspected official documentation describes the Safe 7 as utilizing a highly specific 3-chip claim. It relies on a TROPICO-1, an Optica secure element, and an STM32U5 general-purpose microcontroller.
Why spread the architecture across 3 distinct chips from different manufacturers?
It is a documented strategy to mitigate supply chain risks and single points of failure. The general-purpose STM32U5 handles the interface and non-critical processing, while the secure elements like the Optica and TROPICO-1 are designed specifically to resist physical tampering and provide isolated cryptographic operations. But we must be precise here. This three-chip claim is exclusive to the Safe 7. You cannot assume the Safe 3 or Safe 5 share this exact architectural boundary. You must evaluate each model based on its specific documentation.
Let's look at Foundation, the makers of the Passport.
The documentation reveals distinct architectures between the Passport Core and the Passport Prime. Foundation says they use different code paths, and we must attribute that statement strictly to Foundation. It is their documentation of their own internal engineering.
How do the architectures differ?
The Passport Core is designed around an air-gapped, microcontroller-based system, typically relying on components like an STM32 and an ATIX 608B secure element, communicating via QR codes and microSD cards. The Passport Prime, conversely, utilizes a distinct KeyOS Rust microkernel architecture. It is a different platform entirely, with different operating system assumptions, sandboxed applications, and different communication capabilities. Evaluating one does not automatically evaluate the other.
Let's pivot to a very different paradigm, Bitkey, built by Block.
The inspected official documentation describes Bitkey as a 2 of 3 hardware, app, and server design. It operates as a distributed multisig system by default.
They highlight a seedless recovery user experience.
Seedless refers to the user experience. The user is not required to manage a physical piece of paper with 12 words on it. But the cryptographic keys still exist. They're simply distributed across boundaries. You have a hardware component, an app component secured by the phone's key store, and a server component. This architecture distributes the risk of a single key failure, but it inherently introduces dependencies on phone availability, cloud backup integrity, and server uptime. It is a specific trade-off of autonomy for recovery convenience.
What about Blockstream's Jade and Jade Plus?
The official documentation outlines their current RNG and reproducibility path. The architecture typically relies on mixing randomness from the ESP microcontroller family, combined with sensor readings and a persistent hash state.
Is that considered an audit?
No. Documenting the implemented code path and achieving reproducible builds provides immense transparency. It allows the community to see exactly what the code is instructed to do. But we must not call it an entropy audit or a secure element design. Transparency of the software does not equate to cryptographic proof of the physical hardware's entropy generation capabilities under all environmental conditions.
Finally, we need to discuss Sparrow Wallet, which occupies a unique space because it can act as both software and a bridge to hardware.
Sparrow's architecture requires the user to understand exactly how they are employing it. Sparrow operates as a signer when it creates or holds a seed directly. If you generate a new wallet within Sparrow itself, your desktop computer's operating system, its memory, and its internal random number generator become your absolute trust boundary.
Which means your keys are exposed to whatever malware might be lurking on your desktop.
Yes, the trust boundary is incredibly wide. However, Sparrow operates merely as a coordinator when it constructs PSBTs, partially signed Bitcoin transactions for external hardware signers.
Let's explain PSBTs briefly.
A PSBT is a standardized format that allows a wallet software to build a transaction, defining the inputs and outputs without needing the private keys. Sparrow, acting as a coordinator, builds this unsigned transaction file. It passes the PSBT to your hardware device. The hardware device reviews it, uses its isolated private keys to sign it, and passes the signed PSBT back to Sparrow to broadcast to the network. When used as a coordinator, Sparrow never sees or holds your private key material. Keeping that boundary explicit is vital.
Which brings us to the most practical part of this deep dive. Based on all these verified facts, the conditional models, and the architectural boundaries we've explored, we need to outline materially updated migration decisions for users.
The first and most critical step is classification. You must classify a seed by its creation model and exact firmware and release track.
Not the firmware installed today.
Exactly. The firmware running on the device today is irrelevant to the entropy of the existing seed. You have to determine the physical hardware model and the precise firmware version standard or edge that was active at the exact moment the seed was generated. If that genesis moment falls within Coinkite's revised advisory scope, you must act.
And the action requires a specific sequence.
Update first, and then generate a replacement. You must verify the official release metadata, install the fixed firmware for your exact model and track, and confirm the installation. Only in that newly patched environment should you generate a replacement seed.
What about users who relied on external entropy or passphrases during the affected window?
You must treat DICE and a strong BIP39 passphrase as bounded conditions rather than retroactive repairs. If you perfectly executed 50 or more private independent DICE rolls, the vendor estimates the entropy is sufficient. But if there's any doubt about the execution or privacy of those roles, or if you are relying on a passphrase to shield a potentially weak seed, the mathematically sound decision is to migrate to a cleanly generated key.
For those utilizing complex setups, like multisig, what is the protocol?
Inventory your signer independence and policy thresholds before you move anything. A panicked migration often leads to user error and lost funds. Analyze your descriptor. Determine exactly how and where each key in your quorum was generated. If multiple keys in a 2 of 3 setup were generated on affected firmware, your threshold is compromised. Plan the migration of each signer methodically, ensuring the new keys are generated independently on patched or distinct architectures.
And if you are migrating away from hardware entirely during this process, remember the software boundaries. Keep Sparrow's coordinator boundary explicit. Do not simply type your hardware-generated seed into an internet-connected desktop wallet to check it or move funds quickly, unless you explicitly intend to downgrade your trust boundary to your desktop operating system.
And throughout this entire process, preserve documented backups, descriptors, signer metadata, and release verification practices. Do not destroy the old backups until the new, patched setup is fully verified, funded, and tested.
I have to add an urgent, uncompromising rule to this migration guidance. Never solicit or repeat a listener's seed, passphrase, PIN, dice sequence, private key, backup photo, wallet file, or screenshot. Never share this with support staff. Never type it into a web form claiming to check if you are vulnerable. Never give it to anyone on social media offering to help you migrate. That information is the cryptographic bearer instrument of your wealth. Anyone asking for it is attempting to take it.
That rule has no exceptions.
Let's synthesize the arc of this deep dive. We set out to separate the verified facts from the unverified claims.
And the evidence presents a clear, pragmatic picture. The evidence supports a corrected operational scope defined by the vendor, expanding to newer models with specific entropy estimates. The evidence supports fixed future generation paths via patched firmware across both standard and edge tracks.
We also examine the outside research.
We have a mathematically coherent but conditional mechanism model proposed by Block's analysis, detailing a compile time fallback and reseed limitation. However, the exact historical production build path, the byte-identical proof of how that firmware was compiled years ago, and the real-world incident application remain unresolved by the current evidence packet.
And we mapped out the ecosystem, finding that reproducibility, signatures, error gaps, multisig quorums, passphrases, and distributed service models all answer different cryptographic assurance questions. They are architectural trade-offs, not universal guarantees.
The decisions require evaluating those trade-offs against your own operational capabilities.
I invite you, the listener, to examine your own trust boundaries. Look critically at your signer architectures, your coordinator software, your multisig thresholds, your backup procedures, and your dependencies on external services. Consult the official Coinkite advisory directly. Read the source notes and the official documentation for any hardware you employ.
Relying on verified documentation rather than social media sentiment is the only way to navigate hardware security.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you evaluate your setup. We spent this entire deep dive discussing the intense engineering required to guarantee that a tiny piece of silicon generates pure randomness in total isolation. But as you look at the broader ecosystem, as you consider migrating from a standalone, air-gapped hardware device to systems that distribute trust across mobile apps, cloud backups, and external servers, ask yourself this. Are you actually eliminating your trust assumptions, or are you simply trading them for entirely new, highly complex dependencies that you haven't fully mapped out yet?